California is a place of abundance, and yet there's still deep poverty. It may surprise people to know the extent, especially, of child poverty. Hello, and welcome to Change Lives for Good. I'm your host, Greg Kepferly, CEO of Catholic Charities of Santa Clara County, and today we're talking about the issue of child poverty and how we can solve it here in California. And to help us with our discussion, I've invited a guest, Conway Collis, who is the president and CEO of GRACE. Welcome, Conway. Glad to see you here.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you, Greg.
So, Conway, tell us, what is GRACE and what are your goals?
Well, GRACE, and we're a ministry of the Daughters of Charity, and our entire focus is to address child poverty in California, and especially systemic child poverty. Because what we face in California, and people see us as a somewhat progressive state in many ways, certainly in the presidential election pointed to that. But the fact is that over 20% of the children in California live under the federal supplemental poverty line.
20%?
20%, that's almost 1 million children in California live under the poverty line. That's not just the largest number in the United States, that's the highest percentage of child poverty of any state.
So here we see extreme wealth in California, and then at the same time you're seeing this huge number of children living in poverty. How can this be? What are some of the causes that make this happen?
Well, you know, I think it's really two things. I think it's that, first of all, Californians don't really realize the extent of child poverty in the state. And I think the second issue is that I think there's an element that there's a lack of confidence that we really know what to do about it and we can really solve it. And the reality is that we do know what to do, and we know the things that will work and have shown to be cost effective over the years. And you know, they're really, I think, the things that Catholic Charities of Santa Clara has advocated for over the years. It's all of the early interventions. It's health care and prenatal care and home visiting programs to provide services to people and make sure they're getting their health care. It's child care and early childhood education especially. It's all those things that Catholic Charities has been so involved in. Those are the things that work.
Right, so what you're proposing then is saying, let's look at what works and then figure out how we create a possibility of reducing, or actually you're saying end child poverty in California by doubling down on what the research says works. So what are you seeing in terms of some of that research?
Yeah, you know, we started a process within GRACE 4 years ago, where we started with big statewide conferences. Marian Wright Edelman was the keynote at one, and bringing together all of the state leaders and advocates and service providers, the White House, to look at the solutions. And then we began a series of work groups with over 40 groups around the state participating. And then we started partnering with the Stanford Center on Poverty and Inequality, and they did an 8-month study of the programs that we brought to them to look at what's worked, what's been cost effective, and what can we really have confidence that is going to work, so that this is going to take a combination of taxpayer money through the state. It's going to take nonprofits and faith-based organizations all working together. But if we're going to do that, we need to be sure what we're doing is going to be effective. And so what we put together as a result of that research was the comprehensive range of programs that, taken together, Stanford and others have estimated are going to be able to reduce poverty, child poverty, by 50% in the state over 20 years.
Wow, a reduction of child poverty by 50% over 20 years through a comprehensive strategy of multiple interventions. It's like there's not one silver bullet that's going to get rid of poverty, but it seems like you've got to put all of these interventions together in a pattern or a continuum.
Let's just think about what the stakes are for a minute, because sometimes you're talking percentages and the numbers are big. we're talking about, if we have almost 2 million children in California living under the poverty line, we're talking about moving 1 million kids a year, every year, out of poverty and into productive lives. And you know, I think one thing that I think many of us agree that this is a human problem, and it's something that we have an obligation to address. But it's also a fiscal problem. You know, I was chairman of the State Board of Equalization, and what we see is that if we put in place these comprehensive solutions to child poverty, it's going to cut incarceration, it's going to cut the number of children in foster care, it's going to cut all of the costs of poverty to our state budget, and it's going to turn tax takers into taxpayers. So it's actually going to have an over 2-to-1 return on the investment. So, I mean, this is a human problem. It's also a fiscal problem, because this level of child poverty is actually going to overwhelm the state budget. So we have an obligation to address it, but there's also a necessity to.
So there's the human necessity, and then there's the fiscal necessity.
Precisely.
That if we continue in this trend, both California as a place to live will not be attractive to communities or investors to live in, and the effect on the state budget as more and more people in generations of poverty increase. So by creating that intervention, you're both short-circuiting that loss and, as you were saying, turning takers into taxpayers and to creators.
That's exactly right.
Right.
Exactly.
So from my perspective at Catholic Charities, we talk about this as reducing poverty, but also preventing the cycle of generational poverty. So by focusing on the children, in a sense, you're taking the children, but also their parents, the whole family, to make sure that as those children grow up, they're not repeating that same cycle.
I think that's exactly right. And when Grace was formed, one of the things that it was important to the Daughters of Charity to focus on what was the children and child poverty, because they saw correctly that that's a way to impact systemic poverty. And in fact, by putting these programs in place, we're actually going to reduce poverty overall by 50% in the state, because you're having a systemic impact. You know, it's one reason that I guess it's sexier in many ways to say we're going to reduce it by 50% over 5 years or 10 years. But you've got to do some things to provide enough income supports through EITC, the State Earned Income Tax Credit, through CalWORK, so that children are at least living at a subsistence level. So you've got to do those things, but you've got to invest in the early interventions. And if you do that, it's not going to be an instantaneous return. It's going to take some time, because you have to deal with a generation of kids to have a long-term impact.
Right, and we're seeing that at Catholic Charities. So we're involved with early childhood programs, the First 5 programs, that we're seeing that how effective they are, both for the children in improving their health outcomes, but also their educational outcomes, and then the relationship between the parent and the child. So that parents become better educators, the first teachers of their children. They're more comfortable doing that, and more confident in their role. They become greater advocates in the school. And then as we go up that continuum with intensive after-school programming, where we're increasing the literacy of children in the after-school program, so you're giving that more intensive work. Meanwhile, as you're focusing on the additional income supports and training to help the parents then get ahead as well. I mean, it really is that continuum to make it work.
Yeah. You know, I think one reason that Catholic Charities of Santa Clara has been so important, one example is what you've done with the flood disaster in San Jose, where you've really been so central in terms of responding, and the way that you've helped bring together both other groups and government for a unified response. That's exactly what we need to do with child poverty. It's the same thing. It takes all of us.
Right. It's an all hands on deck. So as I think about the issue of child poverty, it's not one issue. So most government grants and most funding and most services are say, well, we'll give you food, or we'll provide education, or we'll provide health care, or the real issue is housing, or the real issue is jobs, when in reality, it's all of those things together. We need food. The children need good nutrition. They need quality education. They need quality health care. Their parents need good jobs and a good income to be able to care for their family.
You asked early on why we haven't responded to this and why we have such a high level. And the answer is really that there's been a lack of political will, I think a lack of public awareness, and it's really the public that needs to force the issue to say, wait a minute, enough's enough. This is a problem that is reflected in a whole range of, in terms of the incarceration levels, and in terms of people not being able to be ready for good paying jobs, in the number of children in foster care, all the things that we end up paying for that have human implications. We have to say enough. And that's actually what's been done with a recent bill that's been proposed in the legislature. It's authored by Assemblywoman Autumn Burke from Los Angeles, and whole range of groups from all across the state are supporting it, and there's even a Republican co-author of it. And what that does is really put in place a state commitment to reduce child poverty in the state by 50% over 20 years, but it makes that real and it makes it concrete by requiring that every year with the budget, the State Department of Finance, who provides the budget from the governor, the State Department of Finance has to show how that overall budget is going to in fact move towards the state goal of reducing child poverty by 50% over the 20 years. And if it doesn't, you've got the ability to actually hold up the budget until it's adjusted so it's meeting that goal.
So it's really calling the legislators to accountability. And we'll get back to that in a minute as we come back to Change Lives for Good.
GRACE, a ministry of Daughters of Charity, is dedicated to research, analysis, and advocacy to address the systemic causes of child and family poverty. GRACE launched a statewide education campaign titled End Child Poverty in California to educate Californians about the severity of child poverty in our state, raise awareness about the research-backed, data-driven solutions that would reduce child poverty by 50%, lifting 950,000 children out of poverty every year, and to mobilize the public to take action. According to the most recent U.S. Census data, California has the highest rate of poverty in the nation when accounting for the high cost of living in our state. That translates to 1 in 5 children, or 1.9 million children, living in poverty in California. And 30% of African American children and 30% of Latino children live in poverty. The Public Policy Institute of California just published a report titled Geography of Child Poverty in California, in which child poverty statistics were gathered for neighborhoods and communities across the state. From their research, Santa Clara County has the high rates of child poverty. Here is a breakdown of the child poverty rates across the county. Landmark legislation was recently introduced in the California State Assembly that will reduce child poverty by 50% using research-backed solutions. The bill was authored by Los Angeles Assemblywoman Autumn Burke and is sponsored by GRACE. California can set a model for the nation by ending the cycle of poverty in our state. For more information or to join the campaign to end child poverty in California, visit www.endchildpovertyca.org.
Catholic Charities works to end poverty by helping families and individuals get the tools they need to become more self-reliant. It offers a hand up rather than a handout through a wide range of services and serves more than 40,000 people each year of all cultures and beliefs. To donate to the good work that Catholic Charities does, go to www.catholiccharitieссcc.org.
Welcome back to Change Lives for Good. I'm your host, Greg Kepferly, CEO of Catholic Charities of Santa Clara County. And today we're in conversation about the issue of child poverty in California. And I'm in discussion with Conway Collis, who is the president and CEO of GRACE. So we were just talking about this piece of legislation in California that would help focus the legislature on the goal of reducing child poverty. So can you tell me more about the piece of legislation? What is it called? How does it work? And how can people get involved with it?
Well, I'm glad that you asked, because the fact is, we know what to do about child poverty. We can address it. We can really make an impact. And AB 1520, the Lifting Children and Families Out of Poverty, it's authored by a state assembly member, Autumn Burke, would do exactly that. It requires a 50% reduction over 20 years. It requires that the state budget, in fact, move towards that goal every year. And if it doesn't, it has provisions so that the budget needs to be amended so that it is meeting that goal. And it's based on the comprehensive approaches that we've put together with Stanford of the programs that have proven to be effective. Legislature can use other approaches. If they choose to, they can decide to what extent one program or another ought to be funded in a particular year, as long as the overall impact of the state budget is in fact going to meet that goal. So I think the way we get this passed is for Californians to help put their shoulders to the wheel and contact their legislators and their members of the Assembly and the members of the State Senate, the governor's office, and saying, this is important to us. This is something that we have to address. And this shouldn't be a Democratic issue or a Republican issue. This is an issue for Californians. This is about who we are and what kind of state we're going to live in. One way that people can really help is to log on to endchildpovertyca.org, endchildpovertyca.org. And that's an education campaign that we have to let people know the extent of child poverty in the state and that there are proven solutions, and asking for everyone to help with it. So log on, sign up with your email address so that we can let people know what's happening, what stage the legislation is in, and how they can help.
That's great. You know, and as I think about this, I mean, the reality is with nearly a fifth or over a fifth of the children in California living in poverty, that's embarrassing. It's not just embarrassing, it's shameful. Here we are, one of the richest countries in the world, one of the richest states in the nation, and yet we allow our children to live in poverty. I mean, that, you know, I think if we, I get speechless sometimes when we say we allow this condition, but we don't have to. I mean, it's not overwhelming. There are solutions that work. I mean, I know at Catholic Charities, we know early childhood education works. We know our after-school programs with intensive literacy works. We know that putting a whole wraparound program in a neighborhood can lift that whole neighborhood out of poverty with intensive work. And we know that jobs with decent wages work. We know that earned income tax credits put money back into people's pockets. So we know the solutions. We just need to be able to take them to scale.
That's exactly right. And you use the word allow. And you know, that's exactly right. We're allowing it because, as you described, we know what to do about it. We know the comprehensive programs that are going to impact it. And we have the ability to put them into place. You know, we have the resources in California to do it. We just have to decide to use them.
Right. Do we have the community will? I once heard a friend of mine who was the superintendent of the Franklin McKinley School District here in San Jose once say he'd heard from one of his trips to I don't know if it was Scotland or Denmark, anyway, this country that had such a low child poverty rate and a high education rate. They said the way they got there is they got the legislation to say first, the children are our national treasure. Children are our national treasure. Children in California, they're a state treasure. And where our treasure is, our heart will be also, right? So we need to figure out how to make that happen.
Yeah.
So this legislation is really important. Getting people on board is really important. But you've got a commitment to this too. So what is it that's driving you to say, yes, California, we need to make these hard choices and choose our children?
I think in part working with the Daughters of Charity, and the reason that I started working with the daughters is that I realized that they weren't just talking the talk, they were walking the walk, and that there really was a lifelong commitment to addressing the issues of poverty, and I wanted to be a part of that because it was also my mission. And I think it started pretty early when I just saw friends early on, and the impact that either poverty or inequality would have on them. And it focused me on that, and then working in various social service delivery programs before I went to law school made me also see the impact on kids. And the fact is that we really had the ability to change lives, but we couldn't do it without resources. And so it's been the mission of my life because I know that it's something that we can change. And since we can change it, we have an obligation to do so. You mentioned early childhood education. It's a great example where the evidence is just overwhelming that we know that it works. And yet in California, we're almost 600,000 subsidized slots short for children in poverty who don't have access to a quality early childhood education program. Well, that means that we just have to create those spots and give those children a chance. And so it's really a pretty simple issue. We need Californians to pull together and say, this is something that we're going to do together. This is California, and California is going to lead the nation by putting this comprehensive program in place and passing AB 1520.
Yeah, that's terrific, and it really is that commitment that we're saying, as Californians, we're going to make sure that we are committed to these children and we have practical solutions and that we know work. We know they'll save the state money. We know that they'll help the families. We know that they'll help the children, and it'll turn our communities around. Right? And it calls people to accountability too. This is not a government handout, right?
Right.
So that's part of it too, that it's really helping people help themselves in this.
It's, this is really providing bootstraps for people to pull themselves up. But look, these are children. They didn't do anything. Right. They're not to blame for this. Yeah. And this is through the comprehensive program, starting with quality prenatal health care, through child care, early childhood education, some after-school tutoring when required, job training programs for students that are not going to be on a college track, and then some income supports, just so that families are at least living at a subsistence level. I mean, those are just the common sense solutions that have proven to be effective.
So when we look at, maybe dive down a little bit into the job training for those not going to college. So many people say, we want to make sure that every child is college ready, and yet also we're seeing some pushback in the community saying, wait a minute, we have some of our children who may not be interested in college, or that academic track is, may not be appropriate for them. Rather, they're much more interested in career tech, and with people retiring, we're going to need a lot of people with those skills and backgrounds to help us. Is that what the research is showing on that?
First of all, we have terrific community colleges in California. Some are underfunded, but we have terrific community colleges. And the approach that's been shown to work is to work with the community colleges to identify what the good jobs are in a particular community, and to train people for those jobs. And that's really the focus of the comprehensive plan.
Okay. Yeah. So, I always think of this in the model of the promised neighborhood, where it's from cradle to career. Right. And it seems like this piece of legislation really is taking that model, not at a neighborhood base necessarily, but really taking it at a statewide level of saying from early childhood, from prenatal, all the way up to employment.
The Promised Neighborhood program is really worked well, and there's some great programs in California, but there aren't enough of them. And there's only currently 5. And so one of the things that the comprehensive approach does is create additional promised neighborhoods throughout the state in impacted areas, so that the preferred delivery mechanism is through promised neighborhoods, because that pulls together much the way that Catholic Charities has in terms of responses. Right. It pulls together the child care, early childhood education programs through the schools. It pulls together all of these things, working both with children and the parents, so that there's a continuum. And one of the things that's important is it helps to show children and the parents that, college is for you. This is part of what you can do, and ought to be a natural continuation of your schooling, and allows people to know that that's accessible, that there's a way to do it. And then if it's not a college track, it helps lead them into career tech. So the delivery through Promised Neighborhoods is definitely part of it.
Yeah, that's wonderful. While we don't have an official Promised Neighborhood, our Franklin McKinley Children's Initiative is based on the Promised Neighborhood model, and that's with the help of the Packard Foundation and others, First Five, the Santa Clara County Office of Education, the school district. They've really developed that model. So we're very much interested in seeing how this works going forward. We're going to do it. We're going to work to end child poverty in California. So remember, friends, to speak up, reach out, and change lives for good.